Hello and welcome to another episode of Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards. This is episode 16, and as I always explain, I have to say dipshots because YouTube does not like curse words within the first 2 minutes of a video upload, so I have to cater to that nonsense. And today's episode is going to be special because we're going to be looking at a foreign leader a little bit. El Salvador's evil dictator Nayib Bukele, I believe is how his name is pronounced. And you know what? Even if I'm not pronouncing it that correctly, I don't really care because he's a piece of crap. So I'll just call him a piece of crap. I could just leave it at that, really. But of course, this episode is partly about what much of the world is talking about at the moment: the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a 29-year-old Salvadoran national and Maryland resident. It's a story that exposes the authoritarian tendencies of the Trump administration and its disregard for judicial authority, despite belonging to a party that claims to be about law and order. So, despite a 2019 immigration judge's order granting him protection from deportation due to credible threats from gangs in El Salvador, Abrego Garcia was forcibly removed from the U.S. in March 2025, so just last month, and imprisoned in El Salvador's notorious Terrorism Confinement Center. And this facility has been criticized by human rights organizations for its inhumane conditions and lack of due process. So, of course, Trump is sending people there because that's his vision of law and order. No due process, no evidence for accusations. You just send people where you want to send them, and that's the end of the debate or the discussion. So, you could read more about this issue by looking at Politico or AP News, or of course Wikipedia. Time Magazine has covered, some aspects of the due process question. The administration initially labeled the deportation as an administrative error, yet later justified it by alleging Abrego Garcia's affiliation with MS-13, a claim unsupported by any criminal charges or convictions. So, this tactic reflects a broader pattern of the administration using unsubstantiated allegations to circumvent legal protections because they don't want people to have legal protections, whether it's immigrants or citizens. And in response, U.S. District Judge Paula Zinis, I might be pronouncing that correctly, she ordered the government to facilitate and effectuate Abrego Garcia's return by April 7th, emphasizing that his continued detention constituted irreparable harm. See, I almost said the word constitution there. So, anyway, the administration appealed, and the Supreme Court issued a vague order requiring the government to facilitate his release, stopping short of mandating his return. And that shows a Supreme Court that is actually pretty weak, and they did not use stern language in order to, appeal in that sense either. It was just like a vague wording, really. The ambiguity allowed the administration to interpret the directive narrowly, claiming it had no obligation to secure his release from El Salvador. And the administration's stance effectively renders judicial oversight meaningless, suggesting that the executive branch can unilaterally deport individuals without consequence, or, of course, without evidence, or really without even presumably notifying anybody. That is the precedent that they're trying to set here. Just label somebody a gang member or a terrorist or something like that, and the premise is that they don't have rights. So you could slap that label on anybody and just ship them away into a slave prison. So this approach undermines the rule of law and sets a dangerous precedent for unchecked executive power. And one of the ironies is, of course, back when Obama was president, there were all these right wingers who were so fearful of the mythical Obama FEMA camps and whatnot. Like it's actually pretty humorous how they totally dropped that talking point. But I remember they were banding about this claim that FEMA camps are being set up and they're going to detain American citizens, yada yada yada. There was never any FEMA camp that was used in any way like that. But it shows you the weird hypocrisy that's happening here. So, compounding the issue, President Trump cultivated a relationship with El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, whose regime has been accused of authoritarian practices. Well, we just had further strong evidence of these authoritarian practices and, the consequences thereof. This whole story is about that to a large degree, right? Bukele's refusal to release Abrego Garcia, despite U.S. court orders, provides the Trump administration with plausible deniability, at least legally. He will, at the very least, be held accountable to some degree in the court of public opinion, but I guess we'll see what that actually will entail. And, the Trump administration has been flouting judicial authority, and this alliance between him and El Salvador's president exemplifies a mutual disregard for democratic norms and human rights. Because, of course, if you label somebody as a gangster or a terrorist, as El Salvador's president claimed this guy was, well, the premise there is somehow you're not entitled to due process or basic human rights protections. So that's a pretty disgusting sort of premise because, as is pretty well known even by a lot of stupid people out there, even murderers, accused murderers are entitled to rights. Even Ted Bundy, he had a legal team and he was permitted the right to represent himself in court. So if even people like that can have their day in court, then how could anybody argue that a relatively uh, innocent person doesn't have that presumed innocence? We already know in the popular imagination that there are actual violent people out there who nevertheless had a chance to have their case heard. They got a right to face their accusers. The evidence was presented, and there was a jury who examined, and at least a judge, that at the very least. I know that in some cases, jury trial doesn't happen and all that, but usually it does if something goes to trial. And, that's all supposed to go out the window if you're just accused of being a terrorist or something like that. And you, of course, don't even need to engage in terrorism to be accused of terrorism or supporting terrorism. Just have an opinion that they don't like, and what do you know? They might be able to slap on the cuffs and drag you out of your home. It's as simple as that. So that's really the situation that we're dealing with right here. This case illustrates the inherent dangers of centralized state power and the ease with which legal protections can be eroded. The state's ability to detain and deport individuals without accountability, without evidence, and due process highlights the need for reaction from, even decentralized community based organizations that care about justice and prioritize individual human rights over authoritarian control. And the Abrego Garcia case is a stark reminder of the perils of unchecked executive authority and the fragility of legal safeguards in the face of political expediency. We're really seeing the importance of vigilance and resistance against state overreach to protect individual freedom and uphold the principles of justice. That word that is supposed to be sort of a cornerstone of our system of government, but which, ironically, some of the people who claim the most to care about law and order are the quickest to just throw into the trash. All right, so I've got a second segment of this show within a show called the Quadruple D. So the second segment is the peripheral poop head of the week. And this time we're going to look at a dead guy named Fred Trump, whose legacy is ultimately, tied into the situation here. And first off, I want to note something. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, if you've ever seen a picture of Fred Trump. One of the funny things about him is that I think any photograph I've seen of him looks sort of like some AI generated image of Fred Trump. Like he always looks like a parody of himself, an AI parody of himself. It's really strange. I can't really explain that. You're just gonna have to look up any image you can find of him, and I think you'll find that I'm not far off. Like there's just something about him. He looks fake. Like he looks like his face is a Halloween mask or something. I know you're not supposed to make fun of the dead, but you know what? Fuck that guy. I'm going to make fun of him. He really does look like an AI generated parody of himself. So, anyway, Fred Trump was born in 1905 in the Bronx to German immigrants. And, his own parents were named Friedrich Trump and Elizabeth Christ. Or maybe it's pronounced Chris, but it's spelled like Christ. And Fred Trump emerged as a significant figure in New York's real estate scene. His father, Friedrich, had amassed wealth during the Klondike Gold Rush by operating establishments catering to minors, including brothels, or you might want to call them whorehouses or cat houses. I personally think we should bring back the term cat house, um, just because it sounds funny. It sounds funny. But excuse me. After Friedrich's death in 1918, Elizabeth continued the family business, laying the groundwork for Fred's future endeavors. So it was, already a somewhat well-off family. In the 1920s, Fred began constructing single-family homes in Queens, eventually expanding into larger projects. His company, later known as the Trump Organization, developed over 27,000 apartments across New York. During World War II, he built housing for war workers, benefiting from government contracts. Sorry for the awkward edit, but I had to take a little break because I had a coughing spell. But anyway, I was just talking about how Fred Trump had benefited from government contracts, in terms of his building housing for war workers during World War II. However, his business practices attracted scrutiny. In 1954, a U.S. Senate committee investigated him for profiteering, and in 1966, New York State examined his involvement in a $60 million Mitchell Lama mortgage deal, leading to a $1.2 million repayment for overestimated land values. So, he had some legal issues, just like his son would later on in life. Fred's political connections played a role in his success, as you might imagine, because a lot of these capitalists, they don't get as much done unless they have some connections to the good old government. Fred Trump maintained relationships with influential figures like Abe Beame, a future New York City mayor, and Bunny Lindenbaum, a captain in a Brooklyn political club. These associations facilitated access to valuable city land, such as the 75-acre parcel that became Trump Village in Brooklyn. In 1927, Fred was arrested during a Ku Klux Klan demonstration in Queens. So, I mean, you have to wonder uh, why the KKK isn't being designated as a terrorist organization or various Nazi style groups. Don't they ever say anything anti Semitic? Why is it always just these college protesters who are against Benjamin Netanyahu, mass slaughtering Palestinians and deliberately starving them to death? Why is it those protesters who get all of the scrutiny, but the KKK or such groups seem to get off without any sort of serious legal problems from the Trump people? It's a little bit curious, isn't it? I wonder why. Well, the allegation is that Fred Trump, Donald Trump's dad, was, a KKK type of person. He was arrested during one of their demonstrations, and while the exact circumstances remain unclear, the incident has been a point of contention, with some questioning his affiliations. And post World War II, Fred downplayed his German heritage, possibly to appeal to his predominantly Jewish clientele. He even claimed Swedish ancestry, a narrative later apparently perpetuated by his son, Donald. So, Donald Trump joined his father's business in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, and became president of the Trump Organization in 1971. In 1973, the U.S. Justice Department sued Fred and Donald for violating the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against Black and Puerto Rican applicants. An FBI investigation revealed that Fred instructed staff not to rent to Black individuals and to mislead them about housing availability. The case was settled in 1975 without an admission of guilt, but the Trumps agreed to take steps to ensure compliance with fair housing laws. So there you go. You got that little bit of news. If you haven't heard that before, I'm sure some of you out there have, but it's worth noting. Contrary to Donald's claim of building his empire with a small loan of $1 million from his father, investigations revealed that Fred and his wife Mary transferred over $1 billion to their children, avoiding more than $500 million in gift taxes. In 1992, they established a subsidiary to channel funds to their children, and shortly before his death in 1999, Fred transferred ownership of most of his properties to them. These properties were later sold for over 16 times their previously declared worth. Fred Trump passed away on June 25th, 1999, at the age of 19, or I was almost going to say 1993, 93, after battling pneumonia. His legacy is marked by significant contributions to New York's housing landscape, complex political ties, including the racist ones that uh, I mentioned there, and controversies surrounding his business practices and family dynamics. And so, interestingly, I've got a bit of an interesting fetid fever dream flashback of the week because I'm going to pick on Trump's mom a little bit, actually, which people don't really do that much. But let's look at Mary Ann McLeod Trump. And this is a little bit of an interesting case because Marianne McLeod Trump, the mother of Donald Trump, did not have any public scandals of her own. So this isn't going to be focusing as much on that sort of thing. She was born in Scotland in 1932 and immigrated to the United States in 1930. Most of what is known about her public life relates to her role as a homemaker, the wife of real estate developer Fred Trump, and being the mother of Donald Trump. Unlike her son or husband, she stayed out of the spotlight and was not involved in politics or business dealings that could attract controversy on a large scale. That said, even the absence of a personal scandal doesn't exempt someone from critique, especially if they were part of or benefited from systems of hierarchy and capital accumulation. So here's how that analysis might look. What would that assessment entail? Well, there's some complicity by proximity. As the wife of Fred Trump and mother of Donald Trump, Marianne was embedded in a family that benefited from state sanctioned capitalism, real estate profiteering, and systemic racism. That is, Fred Trump's housing discrimination cases in the 1970s. A fair critique might argue that even if she wasn't directly involved, she was part of a household that profited from social and economic inequality, and that implicates her in a broader structure of class exploitation. She obviously didn't do anything to reel any of that behavior in. So, there's a little bit of guilt in that sense. And, you know, it's a little bit funny because the evil, sinister anarchists often criticize the nuclear family as a tool that reinforces authoritarian structures, hierarchy, and the status quo. And it turns out that radical critique, that goofy, laughable critique, actually seems to apply here surprisingly well. So, from that lens, Mary Ann helped raise and shape someone, in this case Donald Trump, who would go on to embody many of the stereotypical authoritarian capitalist values. The home she ran arguably served as an incubator for elitist ideology. And the ideology and the elitism are crystal clear in, the Donald Trump story. There's also an immigrant irony. She was a poor immigrant who later became part of a wealthy anti immigrant power bloc. So, both an anarchist and also any other observer might note the irony in how someone who came to the US with little ended up in a family empire that used political and economic power to reinforce borders, exclusion, and privilege, often at the expense of people like her former self. There's a lot of talk that she was, you know, quite poor originally. So, the irony is actually quite rich here. So while there's no scandal in the traditional tabloid sense, one needn't really look for one. They could reasonably critique her role and reproducing systems of power, even quietly. It's not about drama, it's about structure. So if you want a similar lens applied to someone else and the Trump orbit, you could let me know in the comments, or if you want to reach out to me in social media. I would be willing to oblige. So, this was an interesting uh, look at the Trump family. I will probably end up doing some more of that in the future. And again, I apologize for the awkward edit, but I had a coughing spell and I had to take a break. But anyway, that's it for this episode, and hopefully you learned a thing or two, and hang in there because it's going to be a bumpy ride as this shit show continues.